Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage.
We're Doug and Leslie Davis. Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. Today, we're going to be looking at the drift. What makes your relationship at risk for an affair?
And today we're going to unpack the things that impact the drift. And we're going to talk about internal scripts and how they undermine the relationship and they solidify the drift. And we're going to look at 4 things that you can do to minimize the drift.
One of the things that we learned last week from Garrett and Brenna was that they said about 3 years into their marriage, they found that slowly, over time, they'd begun to drift apart. They didn't communicate as well. They didn't do some of the things they used to do as well. And so it's not something that happens rapidly. The drift is something that takes place over time. And today we're going to look at 3 things that impact that drift.
One is not communicating. We're also going to talk about emotional and physical distance. And the hardest one is the mentality or the belief that will never happen to me.
Right. That's something that we hear a lot from people who then later find themselves really at risk for an affair, that they truly believed it would never happen to them. But I want to share with you what God thinks about the whole situation. We know that not only was marriage created by God before He created His church, and He says that it's for the reason of finding a wife that a man will leave his mother and father and cling only to his own wife. Not only that, we know that God wants our marriages to last, that it's His will for our marriages to last, and for us to find all of the joy that we're searching for in our spouse. I want to share with you, it's a little longer than what we usually share, but I want to share something with you out of Proverbs chapter 5. We'll start with verse 15. I want you to listen to what God's Word says about the relationship and about finding only those things that will fulfill your needs in your spouse. God's Word says, "Drink water from your own cistern, water flowing from your own well. Should your springs flow in the streets, streams of water in the public squares? They should be for you alone and not for you to share with strangers. Let your fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful fawn, let her breasts always satisfy you. Be lost in her love forever. Why, my son, would you be infatuated with a forbidden woman or embrace the breast of a stranger? For a man's ways are before the Lord's eyes, and He considers all his paths. A wicked man's iniquities entrap him. He's entangled in the ropes of his own sin. He will die because there's no discipline, and be lost because of his great stupidity." Now, we do want to let you know that if you found yourself in the midst of an affair, there is forgiveness, there is restoration, there is redemption. But if you're finding yourself tempted and you want to know, is it really that bad? All I've done is really think about it. I haven't done anything. I just wanted you to know that it's God's will for you to find all of those things that you desire forever in your own spouse, not in someone else. And God just says that when we search for satisfaction somewhere besides our own spouse, that we're acting in a way that is a stupid action.
But when that does happen and you are tempted in infidelity, even if it is just fantasizing about somebody else, the Bible says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that the Lord will provide a way out of temptation. So when you do feel yourself being tempted, then watch for what the Lord is doing, and He will give you He'll give you a recognition that this is a time to turn, or He'll give you whatever it is that you need in order to not succumb to that temptation.
Right. He'll always provide a way of escape. And what we found out as we have listened to so many couples, and Brenna and Garrett shared it again last week as well, the temptation for each of them came early, and with each of them, what led to problems for them was that they chose to linger there. They stayed. Instead of looking for that way of escape that God does faithfully always provide for you. He will provide a way of escape. Now, you may be thinking, well, I haven't run into any of those issues. I'm not struggling with temptation for a physical affair. I'm not struggling with pornography. I'm not struggling with an emotional affair right now. Let me just go ahead and let you know that any of us who are breathing can be at risk. We are at risk. Hopefully it's a very small risk that God will always give you an immediate recognition of the way of escape when you're tempted, but you're at risk for the temptation that could lead to an affair. We want to help you to be able to see, first of all, how to recognize where those areas exist, and then secondly, how to reduce that risk.
The reason why we say that you're at risk, even if you don't feel like you're at risk, is because we have an adversary, Satan, who roams around like a lion waiting for those whom he may devour. Like, you're at risk simply because you're married and you're a Christian, or
Right.
simply because you're a Christian, right? And so one of the first thing that we want to talk about that could impact the drift is not communicating. One of the things that Brenna and Garrett shared with us is that when they were tempted, they didn't come back together and share their struggles with each other. They just didn't communicate about it.
Right. And a lot of times it's because of embarrassment or it's because of shame that we don't want to communicate with our spouse. But one of the things that we would encourage you to do is to communicate not only about how you're feeling or what's going on, but communicate about the areas where you're tempted. Because the fact that temptation exists is something that exists for everyone. It's just not everyone will share those things. But finding a way of escape is easiest when you're seeking after God's will. But God will also provide you help. And one of the places where he provides you help is when your spouse knows where your temptations are. Your spouse can help you to reduce the temptations in those areas.
And the reason why that is true is because when you're communicating with your spouse in the areas that you're tempted in, it's because that's going to expose the need in your relationship that's not being met, and that makes it easier for it to be met.
Right, which, it does take us into the second of the things that impact. We're going to spend some time on this issue because we're going to break it into two separate pieces. And that is when there's distance between you and your spouse. And the two most common places where that distance can really have a negative impact and increase your risk of being tempted into an affair is emotional distance or physical distance. And again, we got to hear about both in our interview last week.
And that because that distance was present in that relationship, that caused that distance that opened them up to being susceptible to getting those needs met someplace else. One of the things about being a couple is that you might not understand your spouse's need in those areas. I know there's been a lot of times where Doug doesn't understand my emotional needs,
Right.
but just the fact that he acknowledges that I have emotional needs that are different than his, and sometimes he doesn't understand them, even just talking about that creates an emotional connection that is not easily undermined. And it's not like he's trying to pretend that he understands my emotional needs, because he doesn't, and he wouldn't say that he did, but just that connection of him saying, I don't understand, but I am trying to, or I am trying to provide what you need in that
Right.
emotional, in that emotional realm, even if he doesn't understand it, just creates a connection there that is, that's what's important, is that connection.
So for those of you who thought that we went through communication as one of the things that impacted the drift too quickly, now you see why. As we look at the emotional distance issue and the physical distance issue, one of the solutions then is to increase communication, because here's something that you may have found true in your relationship. It's been true in ours, where there are things that Leslie needs that are very different from what I need, maybe an emotional need that I wouldn't personally feel. Doesn't make it better or worse. It just makes us very different. And we love that about one another. But again, we've shared before how we don't read each other's mind at all. And it could lead to real disappointment if there's an expectation that she has or an expectation that I have, and we don't know what the expectation is, so we're not able to meet it for our spouse. And so with an emotional need, I would encourage you, communicate about what that need is, so that you can begin the process of being able to provide for the need. You want to provide for your spouse. Of course you do. Sometimes you don't know how. Communication is going to be the most important bridge to be able to span that gap between I want to provide and the other side being I don't know how to do it. Communicating spans that huge gap. And so when Leslie has an emotional need and she tells me what's going on, that's step one. That's important. What's even better is when she tells me how I can provide for her through that need. It may be something as simple as, will you sit with me and hold me while I process it? It may be something like, I need you to go with me because I'm feeling anxiety. Or, but again, when you can give communication about what would help provide for that need, that's even better. So don't just stop with, I have a need, so that your spouse can recognize it. When you're able to, provide communication that says, and here's how you can provide for me in that need.
Yeah, I think that takes out a lot of disappointment or, unspoken, unmet expectations, because that communication is solid in that realm. When you think about physical distance, a lot of that is given what time of life that you're in. Also, we had different physical drives, and we're talking about sexual drives. We have different sexual drives in different times of our lives, different seasons of our lives. And one of the things that has helped us navigate those differences is that we had a respect for each other and a humility going into that relationship that caused a balance. Now, that balance wasn't always the same throughout the season. Sometimes it was this way and sometimes it was this way, but it wasn't necessarily out of balance. For instance, when we had young children, and I mean babies, like nursing babies, that was my body's primary giving point right then. Like when you have a nursing child, that's your focus. That's your body's focus. That's your emotional focus. Like that's your whole life is wrapped up in that child. And then when you have a nursing child and other little ones, it just makes it really, really hard to think about connecting with your spouse physically, because your body and emotions are spent on the children. That's not bad. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's where the balance was at that time. And we've always worked to be very respectful of each other. And so there was a lot of times when Doug could tell in me, I was spent. I didn't have an ounce of energy left for anything else, if you know what I mean. And so, and he would respect that, and then there were times where, okay, I have an ounce, I'm going to give that ounce to my husband. And sometimes that ounce, most of the time, okay, I wouldn't say all the time, that ounce was enough, because you were never self-centered in that time or in that need.
Well, let's go ahead and make sure that we are all focused on what Leslie just mentioned. Each of us is able to focus on what our spouse needs, but we're able to do it better when we're able to turn our focus to our spouse instead of turning our focus to what our own need was.
Right.
Leslie had needs. She was mentioning when we had young children, she had needs to not necessarily be as involved sexually as maybe my sex drive wanted to be. And so I would respect her during those times that I knew she was tired and be able to show love in that way. But then likewise, even during the days where she didn't quite feel up to it, she respected my need, knowing that there was one. And each of us would think of the other. Each of us would give what was best for the other from time to time. And that's the balance that she's talking about. Now, we've had other seasons of our lives where different factors were influencing sex drive. And so let's just go ahead and talk about, you may have a struggle right now where your sex drive is different from your spouse's. I would encourage you strongly, both of you respect each other. Both of you be spouse-focused rather than self-focused. So that maybe the one who has a more active sex drive right now can respect and honor the I'm tired that your spouse may have, to be able to say, I love you, and so I'll give you what you need, which is not being intimate tonight. But likewise, the spouse that's sex drive isn't as active right now. You can give to your spouse as well by saying, I realize that you have this need and I want to make sure that you find the fulfillment of that need in me alone. And so it's a thing that both spouses, when you have a difference in sex drive, need to be thinking about respect, love, and honor, and you need to be thinking about your spouse. It's not a one-way street. It's not just spouse A do for spouse B. Both spouses need to be doing for one another when it comes to love, respect, and honor.
And of course, that all needs to be encompassed with open communication.
Yep.
You need to be transparent about what you're feeling and what your needs are so that you can come to a compromise that's respectful for both of you, that's loving for both of you in the midst of that. And I think that's probably the biggest sex talk we've ever had on the podcast so far.
And I just wanted to be a little bit more blunt about it because it is very important. And here's why it's so important. Just like the emotional distance, physical distance and emotional distance are the two leading causes, according to people who do have an affair, that after the fact they recognize contributed to the risk they were in to have an affair.
Yeah.
And here's why.
Contributed to the drift.
Every one of you has emotional needs. You may not notice it because your emotional needs may be very different from your spouse's, but you need to be validated. You need to be heard. You need to be secure. But you need to know that
Loved.
you matter, that you're honored, that you're loved, that what you say is important. You need to feel like you're heard. All of those things are true. Now, it may not be as obvious in your life as it is in your spouse's life or vice versa, but everyone has those needs. And when those needs aren't met, the risk for an affair increases because if someone else comes in and starts providing for that need, what should be directed only to your spouse, now there's a temptation because you're feeling value. You feel like I'm heard. You feel like I matter.
And it just solidifies that drift.
And
there's a chasm there. And if you're getting something met from an outside source that you need that should be within your marriage, that drift is like on and on. Like it's not going to, you're drifting apart, not together, right?
Okay. And so we wanted to make sure, first of all, we recognize the issues that could put you at risk. That's one of them. Now, physically, it's the same type of thing, even though it looks a little bit different. If your physical needs aren't being met, and it's not just sexual intercourse. I want to make sure that we understand sometimes there are physical needs where I need somebody to hug me. I need somebody to hold my hand. I need to know that I'm desirable, that I'm valued and I'm loved when it comes to those physical needs, especially for those who have a love language of touch. If they're not getting touched, they feel unloved. And it's easy for people. We've heard about this again in the interview. There are some people who mistakenly think that sex equals love. We know that's not true, but we know that the physical touch and physical needs are very real, and they're something that should be provided through your marriage when they're not. If somebody will simply hold your hand or put their hand on your shoulder, or brush your hair back, give you a hug.
You're at risk.
You're at very high risk for it to go much, 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 much further. And the line that you think you may have, you'll find it moving if you're not very, very, very intentional about making sure that drift stops.
Mm-hmm. Dave Crowder calls that a close call. And so it's like one step past the drift. Like the drift comes first, and then you start having close calls. So if you work to protect your relationship to not have a drift, then you're less likely to have close calls. One of the other things that will impact the drift is your internal scripts. And this is, it's hard, but it's simple. It's hard because it's hard to get them turned off. Right. But the fix is simple because you just replace those internal scripts with the truth.
With truth.
Right? One of the internal scripts that we heard from the interview last week was sex equates love. Right. And that was the belief that sex equates love. And Garrett worked hard to change that internal script.
Right. Now, as we start to look at internal scripts, this is a good time to take a quick pause because some of you may be thinking, I won't have an affair because I won't go away with someone else and have a physical sexual relationship. But there are affairs that aren't physical and sexual. There are emotional affairs that last for years, where you go off with someone else to get all of your emotional needs met on a regular basis. And then one of the types of affairs that has increased rapidly lately in the last 15 years is the issue of pornography. And often that's not thought of as an affair, but let me just break this down as bluntly as I can. When you are looking to get your physical needs met by looking at pornography instead of your wife, you are having an affair.
Because you're undermining the emotional connection of the marriage.
Right. And because the thing that should be met just within that marriage is being met somewhere else. And you're replacing your spouse with images of random people. And so it's nameless, faceless in the big picture. I mean, you can see who they are, but it's still an affair that we don't often think about. Now, ladies, you're thinking, well, I don't look at pornography. If you're reading pornographic novels, because that's where you're getting your romantic satisfaction, you're having an affair. Because again, those things are replacing what your husband should be giving to you. And we need to be careful about that. It's something we don't like to think about because that's something other people do. That's not something that I do. And so we just want to help you understand that when you think what I'm doing isn't that bad, other people are doing other things, you create an illusion that leads to one of those internal scripts. And the biggest illusion is an affair, that will never happen to me. I would never do that. I'm safe from that. Other people do those things.
I think we heard that from Brenna. That was one of the things that she said in the interview is that that would never happen to her because she wouldn't go that far. She had a line in the sand, a mental line in the sand that she would never cross. And just saying, oh, that'll never happen to me, put her at a huge risk of it actually happening to her. And then Satan came in really quick and said, but this is who you are. Because, her past history was that she had said that she had seen her dad have an affair, So Satan was able to come in at that moment and say to her, well, this is just who you are. Your dad did it. This is just who you are. And if she hadn't worked to change that internal script, then it would have been really, really hard for her to make that emotional connection to Garrett again.
And there's lots of things with your internal script. You might be thinking, I don't deserve to have the relationship anymore. That's not true. Or, the one that we'd mentioned earlier, I've got a line. I won't cross that line. But what we see is then when you stay next to the line moves. Mm-hmm. And so now the line's a little farther than it was, and you stay there, and the line moves. And so when it would have probably been mostly true, I wouldn't do a certain thing, over incremental steps with your line in the sand moving, you find yourself at a place you never could have possibly imagined you'd be.
Yeah, close to those closer calls, right?
Yes.
Or having closer calls. Some internal scripts that can support or impact a drifting relationship is like when your spouse says, I love you, and you feel unlovable. So in your internal script is, that can't be true because I'm unlovable, or I'm fat or ugly or not worthy of love. Those things, those internal scripts, those initial thoughts that underline the relationship, those are all internal scripts that need to be dealt with and replaced with the truth, or it solidifies the drift in your marriage, moving you towards close calls or closer calls, and puts your relationship at risk for an affair.
Right. And you may have a set of internal scripts that are very different from what we've mentioned, but you know what they are right now. Or if you don't yet, continue to look for what are the things that I'm believing that aren't true, because that's what an internal script does. It's something that's not true, but it gets you to believe that it's true and can influence and impact the drift with your spouse. But as we look at the drift, one of the things that we've noticed too is that a drift between spouses is significant, and often it's preceded by a drift between you and the Lord. So as we look at some things, there's some things you can do that will help minimize your risk. Any of us who are in a relationship, simply because we live in a world that throws temptations, anyone's at risk. But there are things you can do that will legitimately minimize your risk.
The first one, absolutely, it should go without saying, stay close to Jesus, stay in the Word, and have a solid spiritual life.
Because a lot of the lies that we believe will be overcome when we look at truth. As we look at truth, we get to see things that we've believed just being exposed for what they really are. Because especially as you grow in your relationship with the Lord, it becomes more obvious to you that what He says is true. You are valued so much that, He gave Himself for you. And so, all of those things, if you're believing, I don't have worth, I don't deserve to be loved, He shows you that your worth is in who He's made you, not in the things that you've done. There's forgiveness, legitimate forgiveness, etc.
And then one of the second things to do is to be self-disciplined. You know when you're in a close call, and if you're spending time with Jesus and spending time in the Lord, He's going to quicken your spirit that if you don't know you're in a close call, or you don't know that you've started to drift, He's going to say, oh, my dear child, you're drifting. Let's move back in this lane and let me show you how to love your spouse, right? He's going to guide you and pull you back into that relationship in a way that honors Him.
And you may be in a relationship right now where you're not sure what's wrong, but something's wrong. You know that there's something that's keeping you slightly apart from your spouse, and you're just literally starting the drift. You're not actively doing something to prevent that. What we're trying to encourage you to do, be self-disciplined enough to recognize when there is something that's creating distance. I don't have to stay here. I don't have to go with the tide of my drifting. I can be intentional about making sure that I truly seek after my spouse and seek after the Lord as well.
And the next one is to seek what is good. Sometimes when we're experiencing a close call, which is, after that we know that the drift has gone on. So if we're experiencing a close call, you can realize that there's something missing in your relationship with your spouse. So turn back toward your spouse, analyze and seek what is good. If you're seeking from your spouse self-actualization, and God says, I am the one who gives you self-actualization, then you need to seek that from God, not from your spouse or not from somebody else if it's not coming from your spouse. So seek the things that are good and move towards the Lord with those, and the Lord will bless your relationship.
Some of the things that cause us to drift make us start to think, whether it's fantasizing about it or just letting those thoughts enter in once in a while about, someone else would treat me differently, or I want something other than what I'm getting, whether it's emotional or physical. The majority of the things that you want, the things are good. Looking for them anywhere outside of your marriage is the problem. But there are a few things that when you're hurt, there's some things that you want that are not good for you. They're destructive. And so one of the other things that we would encourage is you seek what's good. Some of the things you may be trying to replace in your fantasy world or in your thoughts are destructive for you no matter where they come from. Get rid of those things that will be destructive, but seek what is good. All those things that you currently are fantasizing about receiving that are good things, find those in your spouse. Seek the good things from your spouse, which is going to lead to the last little set of things that we recommend that you do if you find yourself drifting.
And we have mentioned this before. Recognize when you're being tempted. And I don't know how else to expand on that. Recognize when you're being tempted, when there's something that's not being met and you have turned towards an outward source, you are going to open yourself up for temptation of an affair. And so recognize when you're being tempted and seek those things from your spouse. Instead of turning outward, turn inward to your spouse.
Right. And so God will always provide a way of escape. We've talked about that, but now turning away from the temptation, turning to your spouse, we want to finish with that concept This is something that we really, really want you to have a conversation with your spouse about. If you have an emotional need that hasn't been getting met, and because of that, you're tempted to find any place that will meet it, okay? Recognize that temptation. Be self-disciplined enough to realize that I need to not look other places. Make sure that it's not a destructive thing, it's a good thing, and then find the fulfillment of that thing you need in your spouse. And so emotionally, if you need value, talk to your spouse about the fact that I need to know that I'm valued. And it's not going to be an overnight fix, but find that fulfillment in your spouse. I need physical touch. I need somebody to walk up and touch me so that I know that I'm loved. Find that fulfillment in your spouse. I need to be able to have a satisfied sexual relationship. Find that fulfillment in your spouse. All of these things that are good that you could be tempted to find somewhere else, being heard, being valued, being physically satisfied, those are things that you should and can find in your spouse. But once again, we go back full circle. You have to talk about it. If you don't communicate, you'll get stuck.
And you have to be willing to understand that part of your role in the relationship is not to be fulfilled by your spouse, but to fulfill your spouse.
Right.
And so when you turn inward to your spouse, realize that that's what starts the ball rolling in the opposite direction. If you have been having trouble or you feel that disconnect, is that not only are you really should seek to fulfill your spouse as opposed to seek to be fulfilled by your spouse. You know, so as you seek to fulfill your spouse is also seeking to fulfill you.
And so it'll start with tell your spouse what you need, but then focus on what you can do to meet your spouse's need. And so the communication will be, here's where I have needs. The action plan is, here's what I'm going to do to meet my spouse's needs and to be focused on them.
Absolutely.
And so again, this won't prevent risk. Anybody who's alive has the risk because we live in a world that will throw temptation at you. But the drift is very real. It sneaks up on people. You find yourself in a place you didn't think you would be. And so today what we've looked at in regard to the drift is what makes your relationship at a greater risk of an affair. Remember, there are some things that you can do to reduce that risk. We would encourage you to have a conversation with your spouse about these things that can reduce your risk so that you can find the fulfillment that you ought to have in one another.
I'm going to put a little plug here. We have a quiz, and I will link this in the show notes, a quiz to tell you if you are a connected couple, a drifting couple, or a couple that is at risk. So if you're concerned that you're a drifting couple, click the link in the show notes and take the quiz.
And we are Doug and Leslie Davis. This is the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast, and we pray that God will continue to solidify your marriage.